Hello and welcome back to Scholar Spotlight. I am here with Carolyn Tynan, who is currently the ACLS postdoc at the Committee to Protect Journalists in New York. She is working on questions of national identity, sovereignty, kind of our new governance in a new world order, and the relationship of authoritarian states to those sort of concepts. She's worked previously on the Arab Middle East, and is currently working on some really interesting projects in Yemen regarding the Yemen conflict. So, Caroline, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to you about your work because it just sounds fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate, for the intro and for having me on here.
Of course. Can you give me the 30-second elevator pitch, right? Our conference networking option of who you are, what you're doing, and why we're excited about having you here?
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully I can keep this to under 30 seconds. So my research, as you're saying, it gets at the relationship between regime type political transitions and foreign policy, particularly with a focus on authoritarian regimes and, regionally speaking, mostly in the Arab world. And my recently published book, Saudi Interventions in Yemen, a historical comparison of ontological insecurity, which is based on my dissertation, it looks at Saudi foreign policy in response to the Arab uprisings in 2011, and it compares and contrasts that with a previous period of regional revolutionary upheaval in the 1950s and 1960s, which was characterized by largely for lack of a better word, secular Arab nationalist revolution. And in both time periods, Saudi Arabia intervenes in Yemen. But the book goes beyond that in terms of looking more broadly at and how those interventions in Yemen reflect Saudi foreign policy in a broader sense in both time periods, and how that's linked to domestic strategies of authoritarian regime survival in Saudi Arabia.
Wow. Yeah. So, well, congratulations on the book. That's a great accomplishment. That feels like an incredibly policy relevant research agenda, particularly given the fact that so much of US and Western foreign policy is kind of predicated on the lessons learned during the 1950s and 60s in the region, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's definitely I see as policy relevant, and was what drew me to this in the first place. Well, because when I first was coming up with a topic to write my dissertation back in 2016, the current war in Yemen was already over a year in, and the Saudi intervention had been going on for a full year at that time. But it wasn't, the conflict was receiving very minimal attention in the Western world, including in the US, even though US support from the US as well as other Western democracies was very crucial to the Saudi war effort. And even though arguably it less so than in the past, and Saudi Arabia's decision-making process in the war was more independent in a lot of ways than in the past, it was still without a doubt and remains doubtlessly connected to these other countries, including US and European support to the war effort there.
So you talk about this a little bit in your written section about people ask you all the time about why this regional focus. And so does it feel like deja vu all over again then? And explaining kind of the political situation that's happening now, and in the context of this kind of larger historical arc and various kinds of interventions and meddlings, right, that are happening.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's a lot. As I was thinking about this project earlier on, there was a lot in terms of what I witnessed, albeit always at a distance, but witnessed as an American citizen, watching U.S. foreign policy play out in the region, like for example with the Iraq War in 2003, which was I would say my first time as a young adolescent watching on television, reading about a war happening that the U.S. was involved in, and which was one, or at least that I so clearly remembered and thought about at the time, even though I was quite young then. And those memories of the sort of justifications used for that intervention, as well as the sort of the discourse and notions about the Arab region and about authoritarianism and violent conflict, all those things were definitely swirling around in the back of my head when I was coming up with this topic. So yeah, I would say that even though and just like with the historical comparison in Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't say it's like, oh, history is repeating itself so much, but there's definitely interesting parallels and things that seem to recur, and lessons that seem to not have been learned, I would say.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's I'm going to be very general and say for those of us who are in sort of our generation, right, and where 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan and the 2003 invasion of Iraq were such important sort of political awakenings, right, that hit at a very, very formative time, have really shaped a lot of our research agendas, right? A lot of the questions and the frames that we bring into this sort of endeavor that we do. But it sounds like you didn't come into the PhD with this project, right? Or have I sort of misconstrued that?
No, no. So as is typical in the US PhD system, I came in, well, I mean, I certainly came in with a general interest in the Arab region and that sort of thing. But I, for my first 2 years of the PhD were, just coursework, and then, the exams, and as well as teaching and all of that. But then, yeah, I guess it was in my third or end of my third or fourth year when I was coming up with this topic. And so certainly things that I had learned along the way, and even prior to grad school, were factoring in. But no, I did not, in terms of like starting the PhD program itself, I definitely didn't have this topic in mind specifically, no.
I mean, that sounds like that's a really great perspective for some of our watchers, perhaps, who are maybe interested in pursuing, higher education, a master's degree or a PhD in a similar field. Do you have any advice sort of for them who are thinking about this?
I would say just to not, especially for I think that this is important, especially important for female students to hear, and young female researchers to hear, is to not second guess yourself so much, because I think that that's very ingrained in academia, and to a certain extent, of course, it's necessary that we constantly question, and it's crucial to research and the creation of new scholarship and new ideas. But it can, if taken too far, become a double-edged sword. And so it's important to, if you have an idea, write it down. And even if don't ever have the thought that, okay, writing this down, it might not go somewhere. It doesn't matter, because one thing that I certainly learned in the process of the dissertation writing and writing over the last few years, more than anything, is maybe that sometimes I'm not entirely sure what I'm saying until it's actually written.
Mhm.
And I had to learn that in the writing and revision process. With the dissertation, I would hesitate and say, oh, I'm not ready to write yet, or I'm not ready. And I have, my advisor to thank for that, because sometimes he would just say, Caroline, no, but you just need to write. It doesn't matter if it's bad. And it took him saying that. It doesn't matter if it's bad. And because he's like, because it's going to be bad. Everybody writes things that don't, but that's okay, because then you figure out what you're going to say, and you rewrite and you revise. And so to not be so overly self-conscious to the point of inhibiting your thoughts from coming onto paper and out into the world.
Yeah, there's real power in the bad first draft, right? Of that, like it doesn't matter, but you're sort of writing your way into bigger thoughts, into an argument and things like that, making those connections that you wouldn't necessarily have done if you're just all alone in your own brain.
Exactly.
What are some of the issues that you face in your research? Not being too self-conscious maybe might be one of them, but broader than that, I guess.
Broader, well, I would say certainly in terms of writing on other countries, and in particular country like authoritarian countries, there's going to be limitations in access, and as well as writing on a country that's in conflict, like is in the case in Yemen. And so the all along this was something that I struggled with in the beginning. Should I really write on this? Am I going to be able to successfully write on it? But fortunately, there was still a lot. If you dig deep enough, you can find things. But there's struggles in terms of getting people. I would say in writing on Saudi Arabia, I noticed I guess it was 2017 when I first started reaching out to people for interviews. I definitely experienced people who were fearful to speak, even if I said, reassured that I would anonymize them or was just, talking on background, and including, and these are all individuals living in democratic countries for the most part,
Mhm.
but just fearful that, if they spoke on a certain issue, that it could come back to hurt them or come back to hurt their families. So that was a roadblock, even in addition to things like the language barrier, because was not, and I'm still not fluent in Arabic, even though I've developed since then. But even if there's no language barrier, there's that barrier of security and safety you have to think of the people to whom you're talking to, as well as just sifting through sources that are things that maybe not haven't been totally verified yet, if it's an ongoing conflict, and it's like new information coming out. At certain points I felt almost like I was like a historian one day as I'm in the archives working on the 50s and 60s, and another day almost like journalists, like chasing after sources for an ongoing, as things are playing out in other countries. So
That's, yeah, you've said so many fascinating things there, but I think one of the big ones that caught my attention is this challenge, right, of ethical research and protecting our research participants, and figuring out ways to bring in, right, their experiences and their knowledge into this story, right, because it's really important and it needs to be heard, it needs to be included in the conversation, but how do you do it in a way that is not going to come back on them, right, because we are so privileged oftentimes of being able to go home, or not have friends or relatives or ties left into those communities where there could potentially be harm. And so I think that's a really important point that you've brought up, right? About how do we do this really important work, but in a way that protects, right, and reassures our people that um, they can be involved and they do have the ability to tell their story and be both, and be protected as well. I could talk about your research all day. I think that this is just fascinating and so interesting, and this sort of orientation towards interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary inquiry, right, both in terms of from the methodology side of like, here you need different tools to get at this question, but also in terms of sort of the theory side, right.
mhm.
um, it seems like you have drawn on that significantly. Would you, I guess I have led the question a little bit, but talk to me about a little bit about how being an interdisciplinary scholar has worked for you in terms of your work and um, where you see yourself going.
Well, I think just the field of political science itself benefits from great more interdisciplinary work, and I've seen this in the work of others, and I see it as a direction in which it's moving these days in terms of, well, again, like here in the US, so much of political science has historically borrowed from the field of economics, and particularly with rational choice theory and a lot of quantitative heavy work as well, oftentimes, not necessarily, but oftentimes going along with that. And I think that working on a project that was partially historical was really beneficial in developing my ability as a qualitative researcher, in being able to use archival sources, as well as historical archival sources, as well as contemporary sources and news sources and interviews, and to combine those together, and in that way drawing from history, but also in terms of building on the scholarship of others that my work theoretically builds on. I would say it also draws from sociology as well, or even psychology to a certain extent with ontological security. And so I think that that's yeah, I think that's really sort of been beneficial, and I hope and I do think we will see more of that in the field of political science. So
Did you feel like you had methodological training on that when you were in grad school, or did you feel like you kind of had to figure it out as you went?
I would say like a little bit of both. And I mean, that's because that's not to say that I didn't have the methodological training. I did. We had to take in graduate school at Temple University where I went. We had at least one course on qualitative methods, and then also actually two in quantitative methods. Even though I really don't use much of quantitative, but we did have to be trained in both. And then I also was lucky enough to attend at Syracuse University in summer 2017 their Institute on Qualitative and Multi-Methods Research, which was geared heavily towards qualitative research methods for social scientists. And I think it was pretty much all political scientists there. So I had a good amount of training. But the reason I say both is because a lot of like I just feel like you learn as you're doing, and you know, you can take courses on these things which were beneficial, but I learned so much more as I was actually doing it too, because especially with something like interviewing, it's a lot of you know, learning through experience that one gains doing that. And so I definitely continue to learn even when I was post coursework and working on the research stage.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing about how well trained you can be and still have to like sort of build as you fly, especially with
Exactly.
something like interviewing, where it's all about sort of your relationship with the individual. I definitely, when I was started to do interviewing, didn't like really fully understand how my identity and positionality was going to like affect the interviews, and how um, I feel like I got a lot of different information and had access to different populations than some of my colleagues might have done. Um, that was great in some ways, but also being shut out of other ways, and kind of having to navigate that space is a challenge, right? But it's not something that you necessarily know until you're on the ground.
Yeah, and actually something you just said reminded me of your earlier question on methods and sort of bringing that, or I mean, your question on, you know, talking about interdisciplinary studies and bringing and how that relates to methods. I think that, yeah, like one of the biggest challenges again in writing on Saudi Arabia was getting people who were both willing and able to talk about these issues, because either they weren't too fearful for themselves or worried about their own reputations, for example, if they were close with the government there. And one of the things that was most useful in that, I think, was the fact that I was writing on things in the past. So
Mm.
for example, I reached out to, and this is really funny to say now, and it might shock a lot of people because of what Jamal Khashoggi is known for now as having been a dissident, and you know why he was killed for his work as speaking out against the current government in Saudi Arabia. I reached out to him in July 2018, and I remember thinking, like, in my mind, I was still categorizing him as somebody who was like, and again, like these binaries can be problematic, but like relative to other people I was speaking to, still kind of on the like pro-government side. Who's somebody who I knew for most of his life had worked, you know, with the Saudi government and sort of as a regime insider. And so I didn't want to approach him being like, oh yeah, like I'm writing this thing that's critical of Saudi foreign policy or whatever. So and of course, I was genuinely interested on this article he'd written on revisionist history in Saudi Arabia. And so the in with our conversation was I wanted his take on historical things in Saudi Arabia. And maybe he would have been immediately responsive no matter what, because he was somebody who was just so genuinely passionate about talking about his country and all different types of issues, and largely praising his country. But he was really excited to talk about some historical things there in like the 1960s period. And I just remember thinking like, oh, this will maybe be something that no matter what one's viewpoint is or how how close they feel to the government there, or how critical they are of it. If you come from the historical angle, it can start as a more objective lens, whereas unfortunately, if you're writing on something that's ongoing, it can be more easily misconstrued as, oh, you have a certain view on this because you're writing critically of their policies and that are ongoing. And so I think the historical lens is so important methodologically speaking to balancing what we know and understand about the present. That's just, why history is so useful. But I also found that is a very useful way to balance with interviews on talking about both past and present in Saudi Arabia.
That's a really great point, because I think you're dead on about well, one, you have to find a way to build a certain amount of rapport, right, with your interviewees, and that's a little bit more of a neutral way. But in the same way that everybody loves talking about what they do, whether that's whether you're a banker or you're a gang member, right? Everybody likes talking about what you do. I think most of us really like talking about our sort of historical experiences, even when they're not our own personal stories, right? They're stories of our country, or they're stories of our community, and somehow that is an easier and more neutral way to open those conversations. I think that's a great tip. Thank you. I want to focus then a little bit on the research then that comes out of these great conversations. You have talked a lot about in your work, sort of the shifting model of Western intervention and interaction with the Middle East, and bringing forward locally informed theories, right, rather than just trying to impose kind of this Westphalian model of the state. What changes would you envision policymakers implementing based on your work?
I think that it starts with even just the discourse and the narrative that's so common to dictators in the region. And this is where I get into like, oh, well, this is where better understanding the Arab region isn't just useful for understanding the Arab region, but it's useful for understanding the entire world, I think, because I see these narratives play out, especially, working at a global press freedom organization. I see these narratives play out all over the world, which is this idea that dictatorship is somehow leads to or facilitates stability, and that there's some sort of binary between a stable authoritarian government or a stable dictator on the one hand and just anarchy on the other, or the trope that's always used in the Middle East and the Arab world is radical Islamic terrorists, or a theocracy that's extremely anti-Western, like the regime since 1979 in Iran. That somehow that's an oppositional binary to a stable dictatorship. But I'm just speaking of Iran again. That's a lesson that somehow was just never learned, I guess, in terms of Western policymakers, because it's not. I don't know if this is a generational thing or what, but I did have a few students who were aware of the history that the U.S. had been involved in overthrowing a democratically elected leader, Mossadegh, in Iran in 1953. And, there can go on and on about, how foreign policy of different governments, including Western governments, has been flawed. But the most important takeaway, though, is that the fact that the regime that preceded the Islamic Republic was one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world at the time. And the fact that you now have its replacement is just as bad, maybe in some ways worse. It doesn't matter what the ideology of the regime is. It doesn't matter if it's so-called secular or Islamist. If it's authoritarian and systematically deprives people of individual rights and civil liberties, and the freedom to assemble or to have any say in their government, and basic economic dignities. If it deprives them of these sorts of things, it doesn't matter what its ideology is. It's authoritarian, and that authoritarianism breeds instability, and because sometimes so much repression can lead to a revolution, but that revolution doesn't necessarily lead to a more stable situation. And
Right.
I think that's the lesson that just has yet to be really learned and understood, especially from outsiders. And maybe I shouldn't just say outsiders, because again, this is something that the dictators, the region, are just so, they're really quite genius at in convincing other leaders around the world that the reality is.
Yes, it's sort of this corollary to the democratic peace theory, right? Is the dictator peace theory of that it's better to have this governed, stable dictatorship than this quote unquote ungoverned space, or this radically governed space. But that really is not necessarily, they're not in opposition, right? They're not, as you said, binaries. There's a lot more nuance there. What do we do about authoritarian states and dictatorships then? I mean, that's kind of a huge question, and I'm sorry that I have just dumped on you, but I guess if you had a magic wand, what do we do about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly it's I wish I had some sort of answer, but I could start with what we shouldn't do. Because speaking of these binaries, one thing that I think is so unfortunately that came out of the US intervention in Iraq in 2003, for example, because I've heard this from just a number of people, including somebody who I once spoke with, who was a soldier in the US military, who really had like well-meaning thoughts and ideas and was certainly like pro human rights and democracy and all these great things, but this idea that, well, if you don't have a dictator in power, you're gonna have chaos, and pointing to the intervention in Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein as evidence of that. And this idea that, okay, because we shouldn't do military interventions, that means we should support dictators. And I think it's really important to push back against that and to say, no, both are bad. And they're actually kind of two sides of the same coin. Because a military intervention gone wrong, or military intervention, of any kind that doesn't lead to sort of lasting stability, we saw in post-World War II Germany and Japan, for example, which for all kinds of reasons are tricky to compare here, conflict is going to actually lead to a great source of propaganda for dictators. And in fact, it is ongoing now in the region and around the world in terms of pointing to that intervention. So I would start with saying not to think of military interventions and forcefully imposed regime change as the solution. But that doesn't mean that you sit back and do nothing. I say investing and engaging in diplomacy is a clear start to work towards progress. I think the Iran nuclear deal that the U.S. agreed to in 2015 was absolutely a step in the right direction in terms of working multilaterally to hold an authoritarian government to account and deal with a potential security issue, while also dealing with the problem of sanctions, and the fact that sanctions, you have to be careful with sanctions, and they don't necessarily oftentimes don't hurt the regime, they might hurt the people, which then comes back to hurt the cause of democracy. So I think those sorts of diplomatic efforts and bringing multiple countries together at once to work on them together rather than unilaterally are really important. And also listening to people in the region, civil society groups that they've formed. And so in the case of Saudi Arabia, now there's just so much opposition activity abroad now. And I think taking those voices seriously, as well as taking the voice seriously of NGOs and human rights organizations that work so hard to document the abuses there in all sorts of authoritarian countries. And finally, I guess the other thing, I mean, that connects back to all this is that even if it seems like there's no answer, because these clear-cut, tangible actions like a military intervention or a forceful action against the government can backfire and really can truly be the wrong option, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything. And I think just the importance of words matter so much. And so a difference between a Trump administration and other administrations, for example, in the US, that while might have problematic legacies in supporting dictators, it makes such a big difference when, even if there's flaws in US policies, if at the very least powerful democracies like the U.S. are willing to stand up for like on a discursive level, stand up for human rights. I think that's something that can't be overlooked, because even if the legacies and the policies are tricky, it's important to always speak out when a crime against a clear crime against human rights is happening.
That's, that's some really, really interesting things that you've just brought up. That I could talk to you about this for the next 6 hours, but I will try to limit myself. But I think, if policy makers can recognize that they've got a lot of tools in their toolbox, right, and tools that are as low cost, right, as publicly and intentionally calling out this behavior, right, using kind of the sort of public opinion, so to speak, right, in international public opinion to sort of name and shame. And we live in an era when it's much easier to directly message, right, populations. We don't have to necessarily go through governments. We have social media, we have Facebook now, and that is absolutely a double-edged sword. But it also, policy tools are more than tanks, right? And we have some really great options there. I think oftentimes in kind of these conversations, particularly in the United States, but with other Western actors, right, there's this kind of, we saw a real pendulum shift away from interventions, right, and this withdrawing, right, this recentering, this rejection of globalization. And at the same time, a lot of sort of foreign policy watchers and international thinkers are pointing to the rise of China, right? And China becoming more interventionist or more outward facing, right? Particularly in the Middle East and in Africa. Is that on your radar at all in terms of how that might impact kind of the continuation of authoritarian states and dictators? Or is it kind of overblown, right? Is it kind of sort of the academic version of clickbait that I have just asked you?
No, I think that it's definitely, we are living in an increasingly multipolar world, and that I think that is a reality. But on the other hand, it's true that a multipolar world doesn't just happen overnight, and the U.S. is still one of the most powerful countries in a lot of ways, and still has influence. And again, getting to the region that I work on, arms deals and things like that can't just, a switch in or an ending of arms deals and that sort of thing, or a pause on selling arms to Saudi Arabia, like President Biden did with Saudi Arabia's war effort in Yemen. That doesn't just change the whole situation overnight. In a lot of, not just in terms of the war, which clearly it doesn't, but also in terms of decades and decades of terror connections between these countries. They don't just change overnight, and Saudi Arabia knows that. And so the U.S. remains one of the most, if not the most important arms exporter to Saudi Arabia, even if they are indeed courting other powers, and I think would plan to regardless, even if they plan to just use that as leverage, and which I think is what they're doing, and what they do hope to do, is to use that as leverage and to say, hey, if the U.S. tries to put these restrictions on us, we're just going to go to China, we're just going to go to Russia. It's not so easy for them to do that. They can't just do that overnight, but it doesn't mean that they're not thinking about it, and it doesn't mean that they're planning on it in a more long-term sense. But for now, they still very much require U.S. Military support for what they are doing. And so the U.S. and the U.S. military remains an extremely vital and integral player in the region and in other places, and that's certainly, major changes are happening, but not overnight. I see it.
Yeah, so nobody panic yet, right? This isn't headline grabbing as perhaps it's obvious. It's nuanced, right? It's a lot more, like all of our work, right? It's a lot more complicated than a bumper sticker can make it. I want to be respectful of your time. I'm so grateful to having gotten to talk to you for as long as I have. How about to close us out? obviously we should all read Saudi interventions in Yemen, but what else should we be reading?
Oh, this is something that I always struggle with answering in terms of um, recommending other works and books, because there's just so many great things out there and constantly new ones coming out. On the topic of the Arab Spring, I would say Asif Bayat's book Revolution Without Revolutionaries
Hmm.
is really helpful in terms of making sense of not just the Arab Spring, but arguably what could be sort of a new wave of mass mobilization and grassroots politics, not just characterizing the Arab world, but much of the world today. And so I think it does a really great job in comparing that and with other revolutions in the past, in particular the Iranian Revolution, and how revolutions stay less centered on ideology. And it's one of those things that I came across after I'd written most of it, and I was like, oh, this actually fits a lot of what I'm saying. But then in retrospect, it was like, okay, this helps me further kind of refine my ideas and my thinking. So I would definitely recommend his work. And also Ivan Krastev has some similar stuff that gets at the role of ideology in authoritarian regimes and how that's changed over time. And then on Saudi Arabia specifically, May Darwish's article, or her work in general, but in terms of specific articles, she has this really great piece, The Ontological Insecurity of Similarity, Wahhabism versus Islamism in Saudi foreign policy. That was something that, again, it was something I came across after I'd written a good amount, and then it really was useful in refining what I was working on. And I think does a great job in understanding shifts or explaining shifts in Saudi foreign policy over time.
That experience of finding works that speak to what you're doing is so wonderful, but also a little bit panic inducing that like, oh no, have I been recreating somebody else's work? But realizing that what you're doing is valid and situated right in this really rich literature is also very affirming. Like once you get over that initial panic, discovering the source. I've just picked up Stephanie LaCroix's book on your recommendation from your written Scholar Spotlight. So I'm looking forward to one day when we get to go back to the beach, digging into that a little bit. But I really want to thank you for your time and your really great thoughts about sort of how we think about the Middle East and how we think about authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that with everybody who obviously closely follows the Scholar Spotlight agenda. But other than that, I will sadly let you go, Dr. Tynan, and look forward to picking up your book and seeing the work that's going to come out here soon.
Thank you so much, Kate, for having me.